This is Leadership Beyond, your community of conversation.
But this is the first time in my professional career that everybody, 100% of us, are consciously aware we are engaged in the change initiative.
Yeah, everything. I mean, COVID caused us all to go through change, right? At the same time, but our experiences were so different.
Facing these unprecedented times in isolation is pure insanity.
So thanks everyone for joining us, and thank you Jackie and Cheri for joining us as well. I'm here with Tom and we are going to talk about Conversations Worth Having, which is the title of this wonderful book that Jackie Stavros and Cheri Torres have written, and we're going to dig right into that. So everyone, thank you for joining us. The subtitle of your book is Using Appreciative Inquiry to Fuel Productive and Meaningful Engagement. So just to ground our community, would you please just share a brief description to define appreciative inquiry for us, and we'll go from there.
Sure. Appreciative inquiry is the search of what's best in a situation, and what is of value to a situation, discovering what you want more of. If you just took one word at a time, appreciate or appreciative means I value you, I value the situation. And inquiry is very powerful. Let's get curious and have a conversation and ask questions to figure out what's the best of and how we can move forward.
So I appreciate you, and I'm curious.
I value you.
Mm-hmm. And I value you. That sounds so easy. Why is it not?
I would like to add to that just a little bit. It's also about adding value. So questions that add value, and engaging in conversations that add value, which means sometimes paying attention and pointing out problems and issues is of value. It's how you go about it that makes the difference with appreciative inquiry.
And here that I'm thinking how often in conversations we're focused on being right, and we're not really focused on discovering where our differences are. So if we evaluate our questions, do they bring us toward what we want, better relationships and results, or do they bring us to a dead end?
Nice. Very true. Are we moving forward, or and even are we moving forward looking forward as opposed to moving forward by pushing away from what's behind us?
And the word you use is generative questions. Talk a little bit more about that and give some examples of dead end questions and generative questions.
So a generative question is one that really widens your view. As you just mentioned, Tom, that we come to situations trying to get it right, or to problems trying to fix them, and we usually have our own set of blinders on. We kind of visualize through the lens of our belief systems and our worldview, and generative questions widen that view. They expand so we can see more. We can see more of what other people think, what they know. We can see more of the situation. We may not even be focusing on the real problem because we haven't expanded the view. So a generative question actually comes from a place of curiosity, and it makes the invisible visible. It creates shared understanding. It can generate new knowledge. For example, I wonder how they do this at the next company over. What could we learn from them? And they also generate possibilities and creative, innovative thinking.
And I would add that they reveal the hidden assumptions. They invite diverse perspectives, and you ask people, tell me what you're thinking, or what are you wishing about?
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask for, is an example of what a generative question looks like versus I think, are they depreciative questions?
Mhm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Depreciative questions is where I come at you and I'm critical, and I would say, I don't understand you. What do you mean? Why did you do that? Who's to blame? You know, you know when people are coming at you with a depreciative question, because it's devaluing the person, it's devaluing the situation, and it's putting you into this protect mode that you want to just shut down and move away from the situation. Where appreciating the person and valuing the situation is, as Cheri said, it's opening you up to like a connect mode.
And I would like to talk about the perception on the surface that it could be Pollyanna, but it's anything but that. So positive thinking sometimes devolves into pretend. Like I smile and say, everything's okay, nothing's bothering me, Cheri.
Right.
And,
Yeah.
and that's not really positive framing. What that is unwilling to explore. And so talk a little bit about dealing with real crises and honoring that it's difficult. We don't know the way forward, but we're curious and positive, meaning we believe we can get beyond it, but not positive in the sense of, oh yeah, no problem. Keep dumping on me.
Mhm.
Yeah, I like to think in two different terms. There's that always being positive, the Pollyanna that you're referring to, which is actually quite toxic in a culture or in a relationship, versus engaging in conversations that result in positivity, which is a sense of positive emotions. That's Barbara Fredrickson's research.
The positivity ratio, rather than smiling, say everything's great, you lost
Right.
Johnson and la la la. No, it isn't. It's real. It's authentic.
Yes. And so even in situations where there's a crisis, especially if it's about a personal crisis, asking people questions that may look or sound like they're negative, like, tell me more about what's happening for you. It may look like I'm widening the hole that the person is sitting in, but if ultimately my questions help that person feel seen and heard, then they have added value. And once they've been seen and they feel heard and understood, then you can begin to shift to conversations or questions that actually start to move forward. Like, so how is that impacting your work? Or how is that impacting your relationship with the person? What would you like to do? How can I support you? What do you need? What needs to happen now for you? And that then you're beginning to move forward. But those early questions that sound like they're problem oriented actually can result in a sense of positivity, and that's what's shifting the way people are thinking and seeing.
Because you're working through the negative rather than avoid it, coming from a place that we can be constructive and appreciative and find out what adjustments we can make.
Yeah, the trick is not to spiral in that negative place, but to broaden it enough that everybody feels seen, heard, and understood. And from that place, you can move forward.
So could we work that through with an example of a scenario of a team? And I'll use some personal experience to leverage here. To, imagine a team where we have their teammates and there's some clear frustration within the work that they're doing. And a leader is attempting to just understand what's going on. The leader also being frustrated, but trying to apply these appreciative inquiry practices and saying, I don't understand. Can you tell me more? But the team feeling like they're taking a defense. They're having to defend what they're doing when that leader is simply trying to truly understand and pave a way forward, but it's not being received that way. Mm-hmm. Can you kind of talk through how, like that kind of scenario, and how would that leader is there a change in the way that the question is being asked or in a tone? How do you turn that around? Because the question's there, curious sounding question, but not perceived that way.
Yeah. So I think one thing you said that was really important is your tone and direction. Tone and direction, you want that appreciative tone that could lead you in a positive direction. If I come across in a critical or negative tone, I'm shutting you down before I really begin. So tone and direction is important. And let's take the problem you said, a frustrated team. And if I walked in and you're my team and we all kind of agree that we're really frustrated as a team, there's generative questions, and the second practice is what we call positive framing. So we name the problem. There's agreement that we're frustrated. So we call it the name it, flip it, frame it. So you would simply say, so what is the opposite to all of you? What's the opposite of frustration? So what's the opposite of frustration? Can you name it?
Content.
What's if we flip it? Content.
Content.
And then I would say to you, okay, so if you are content, the positive opposite is true. Let's clarify what we really want to talk about. So if we are all content as a team, what do we really want to have a conversation around? What do you really want to build here?
So it's asking, like, what does that look like? What does the opposite thing look like? Hey, clearly, guys, we are all frustrated. We're not going down the right path. Let's talk about what's the opposite of that look like? How do we want to be showing up?
So if you say the opposite of a frustrated team is a content team, and let's say the positive opposite is true, that the four of us are so content, let's have a conversation of what a high performing team looks like. And that's what we could begin to do an inquiry of, is what are the things we need to be doing so that we are a cohesive, high performing, happy team. And that's where we begin to do our discovery into, is what makes that possible. And I would bet there are times when you're not fresh, and that's what we begin to do a discover around.
So framing it to reflect on the times when, there was a point in time where we worked really well together and we were just jiving, we were in the flow. Let's reflect.
Yeah, what made those conditions
times
possible? What was going on?
What other stories have you, what other experiences have you demonstrated, within the work that you've done? That, I mean, the high performing team and the frustrated team, I'm sure is a common one, but are there other, cases where you've been able to apply this, and it's the reframing and the generative questions that are the two practices that kind of anchor the switch? Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
Yes. And there are so many of them.
And sprinkled throughout your book. So what are some of your favorites?
Well, one of them, again, is with if you want to talk about team frustration. And sometimes it's important to look at, what are we frustrated about? And what is it that we want to have happen around that situation? And in our book, we talk about a time when an employee is typically late every Wednesday morning for the Wednesday early staff meeting. Mark is the manager, and he can tell that the team is getting frustrated. He's starting to get frustrated. And he's trying to frame the conversation, and he thinks through, okay, Melissa's always late on Wednesday morning. Melissa's always on time on Wednesday morning. That would be the flip. And then he thinks, well, what is it that I really want? If Melissa is on time every Wednesday morning, what does that contribute? And he kind of came around to the point, well, we have a cohesive team where people trust each other and they feel respected by one another. So he went in and initially with that as his frame, because he knew Melissa was on board with that and they could have the conversation around that. And then at the last minute, his advisor said, what don't you know about the problem? And he was like, well, I don't know why Melissa's late every Wednesday morning. And his advisor was, is she always late? And he said, no, only on Wednesday mornings. And so, he spent all this time reframing and flipping, and when he went to talk to Melissa and asked, what's going on Wednesday mornings that you're always late? And she said, well, I'm, it is the only day of the week where I'm the one that has to drop off my child at childcare, and they don't let me in until 8 o'clock, and I can't be here, but I try to get here as closely as, and he's like, so we could just adjust the time. And she said, yeah, any other day of the week I can be here at 8. And if we made it 8:30, I would always be on time. And then he realized this is partly on me, that I just set the date for the meeting without asking anybody. And what does this say about the fact that Melissa wasn't comfortable saying to me, I can't be there at that time? And so the conversation, it ended up being around cohesiveness, which is where his mind was when he went in. It got him off his critical mode. But suddenly he was part of the scenario, and it created a lot of changes in the way they decided to do business as a team.
That's a great story.
The opposite of curious would be assuming. And so many times we ask questions assuming we already know the answer.
Yes.
And it's not really doing real inquiry, and it's not real appreciation either, but it's habitual.
It is. And the other thing that goes right along with that I think we often do, I know I often do it, is I will ask myself a question about a person. Like, I wonder what's going on with her. She's always late. And then I'll make up the answer instead of asking the person the question that I'm thinking in my head. I just make it up.
Yeah, I have both parts of the conversation many times.
Exactly.
And think we had it. If you think about Melissa, she might have wanted to say something and think, well, that's inconveniencing the rest of the team, asking them to have the meeting when it's best for me. And so she wouldn't ask it in that case, instead of seeing if there's a reason it has to be on Wednesday at that time. Gosh, we all need to keep practicing this.
Absolutely.
Why a second edition?
Oh, wow. That was the second edition came quick. Cheri and I were just talking about this morning. And one of the things, several things we figured out, but the two that come to the top of my mind is when you want to get above the line of, appreciation, you're either above the line or below the line. And when you are in that appreciative space and you're above the line in the connect mode, we realize that you really need to tune in to yourself, where am I, and to the people you're having a conversation with before you can jump into these two practices. It makes it so much easier. And by tuning in, we mean, if you're listening, follow along, just imagine that you take a pause, a deep breath. How does that feel? And then you begin to get curious so that you can practice the practices. And so that's the new chapter we added. And then the power of questions, we realized how powerful it is, as Cheri mentioned, when you're trying to name it, flip it, frame it, that you ask generative questions to don't have assumptions, but that we build everybody into what is the real problem? And what is the flip of it? And if we're there, what's really going on? So those were a couple of reasons. And the third thing, in the back of the book, we added a list of generative questions of what are really good generative questions to ask yourself before you engage in a conversation worth having with others. And then we have a set of questions that you can begin to ask with your teams, as you mentioned.
Well, you know what your next project is, don't you?
No.
Well, I'll tell you what the market needs. And I happen to know you do this already in your training, but the general public doesn't have it, which is a field play, a workbook. Because when I hear this story, and you really already have the content, but you get just a little taste of that in the book, like you're saying, and more in the second edition than the first. But it really is a self-leadership exercise before it is dealing with the team. And my conversation in my own head is often circular and dead end, and there's no appreciative or inquiry to it. Yeah. So that just came to me. I'm not really giving that as an assignment, but I'm thinking about the training that you do where you really help people to come up with a way to apply it right where they are. And that's in the book, but there's only so much of that you can do. So sort of a field workbook that we get out there, because
Yeah.
I'm curious about COVID and the reality people are dealing with. This is even more essential because there's a lot of added assumptions that come into the hybrid workplace. So I guess that was a statement more than a question. So let me ask it as a question. Or Adrian, you ask it as a question.
How has the COVID pandemic heightened the importance of appreciative inquiry and having the right kinds of conversations and how to have them?
Boy, what a great question. I am, I'm actually not sure of the answer to that question. It actually would be a great conversation for teams to have, is how has COVID made it even more important for us to have conversations that help us connect virtually, because when we're face to face, we connect around the water cooler, we connect over a cup of coffee, we pass each other in the hall and ask about, non-work things. But when the only time you're meeting is on Zoom for a meeting, that personal connection space often gets bypassed in the name of being efficient. And so taking that time to really make sure the relationships are strong and the trust is there, that mutual respect, that people are finding out, how are you doing? Some people are thriving in COVID and being at home and being in a virtual space, and other people are depressed. And I know I keep reading about how so many people are struggling with the virtual world. And in part of it, I'm guessing, is that we just don't take the time to have the conversations that build relationship. And so how can we do that? How do we make sure we do
Look
that?
at the curiosity, look at you practicing what you teach rather than coming up with an answer. You started to investigate it and knew that it requires more conversations. I had an example just today, a CFO client, and he was saying that there's somebody he works with that wants to have these check-in calls all the time. And he wants to say, I don't have enough time for that shit, but he realizes that people are wired differently. And this person needs more than he would prefer, but less than he actually wants, more than my client would want to give. And so if we have the conversation, we can find some people don't need that. They want to get on with their family. Just let's have our meetings. Let's get to it. And Adrian and I do work as talent optimization specialists to understand we don't have the same need. But if it's cappuccino on the 7th floor, the way it gets regulated is the people who don't go to the 7th floor. And then the other people probably sit around the 7th floor too much. And they needed that conversation anyway, and they don't happen. And so there's a people feeling they're not being appreciated, and it isn't necessarily true. It's just that I have 4 Zoom calls and I'm going to get in here with Cheri and do what it is we need to do. And it's causing misunderstandings.
And there's been a lot in the literature that, and this has, the employer said, come Labor Day, everybody's coming back to the office. And then we're like, wait a minute, the employees don't want to come back every day. And so even the literature is divisive. So you should be having and one of my clients I've worked with, we said, why don't you ask the employees? Why don't you ask the employees what they would like to see happen? What has worked well virtually? What has worked well in person? And pair up an employee with a manager, and then get them having these conversations and create what does a hybrid working environment look like? Because what we know for sure is we went from like 30% teleworking before the pandemic to 100% the world, unless you were a frontline worker. And thank you, frontline workers are in healthcare. Amen. Everybody had to figure out how to work from. So we know working virtual works and we know in person works. So they said it's going to take organizations 2 to 3 years to figure out this versus dictating This is how I want you to come to work.
Mhm.
And people want a policy, and it isn't a one size
Right.
fits all.
No.
Yeah.
So you decided that Wednesday was a work day, and poor Melissa.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
There you go.
That happened.
So many companies said, okay, well, we'll give them a couple of days. So and they just make up which day it is,
Right.
instead of really looking at the
Mhm.
community you're dealing with and coming up with something that
Mhm.
It's easier
is-
just to say, right? It's easier just to say it, and
Yeah.
because there will be as many employees as you have, there will be that many opinions and needs, right? So then what do you do? Then
And,
what do you do with that?
and some organizations are getting real creative. One of these organizations my daughter works from is called an RDO, and it's regular day off, where every 2 weeks she gets to take Friday or Monday off, whichever day she wants, because they're working longer hours because they don't have to commute at home. And
Oh.
another, I think I read about this in the automotive world. You can work anywhere you want for 30 days as long as you can't leave the US. So one of my colleagues says, I'm going to Hawaii in January to work for 30 days. I live in Michigan. And I thought, how can you do it?
Airbnbs, right?
That's
Right,
what
for
he
Airbnbs.
that's what he said. And he says that's a benefit to an employer to go work from Hawaii for 4 weeks.
Yep.
yeah.
Yeah.
But we can't come to those kind of solutions unless we appreciate and we inquire.
Yeah.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
I think the other part of that is really recognizing that the systems we had in place before COVID, we put them there because we put them there originally because we thought they would support the work we were doing.
Mhm.
And then we kind of forgot that we built those systems. And then we kept patching and doing workarounds. And COVID has given us this opportunity to say, wait a minute, we can completely redesign the system. How would we design it if we were designing it to support us at our best all the time? Let's throw everything up in the air and reinvent our structures, our policies, our practices, but let's have conversations before we do that so that we can be finding out what our policies and structures actually need to support.
Yeah, I really commend companies who are taking that step instead of saying, okay, we can go back to work. So everybody back to work, right?
Yeah. Yes.
And like to really learn from the last, what is it now? Going on 2 years?
Be
It
2
is.
years in
even
March.
add
2 years. I lost a whole year somewhere and my whole
Yeah.
calendar is thrown off. But the other thing that I have observed, and I'm interested if you've observed this as well, is that we had so much empathy 18 months ago.
Mm,
We were all thrown and we all had to do what we had to do. And now, of course, 2 years go by and now we have new habits and new patterns and new ways of working. And some of us have kind of settled in begrudgingly and some of us have take that and run with it. But we still need the empathy that we had 18 months ago, because there's still things going on that we have to account for. Like Melissa still now she's got to get her child to school. She might have had to teach her child.
right. The child might be at home right now.
Right. So she didn't have the 8:30 boundary, but she had all kinds of other boundaries. And so how do we remind people, and this is what I preach all the time, is we are humans. And I do a lot of change management work. And so, I'm all about, hey, we're driving this change for this thing. It's whatever the thing is that we're changing. And we are people at the end of that. And so let's not forget that it's people. Yes, there are policies, and yes, there are systems, and all of those things have to happen to make us operational and successful, but we are humans.
Yes.
And so bring the empathy and keep bringing the empathy.
Yeah. One of our colleagues uses a term, compassion fatigue. And when you said, at the beginning, everybody had all this compassion, and I was like, remembering back to, Italy, playing music out the windows,
Yes.
and people, around here, people got out, and at a particular time of day, everybody got out and yelled thank you to the frontline workers. And
we went for walks with our dogs and our family, right? Who's
Exactly.
doing that now? We're all stuck to our computers on Zoom.
Yeah. Yeah, I think there's a conversation there about what builds your capacity for empathy and and compassion, your ability to be resilient. And I'm guessing, I don't know, it's a conversation that I need to have, but it's definitely worth having around what does it take? And my guess is it takes time away from, do, and time with people and out in nature and just being.
Tom and I talk about this all the time. In
All
fact,
the time.
we just talked about this 2 days ago, the difference between how we're, especially this season, December, the holiday season, how much we are just doing instead of being. And I think you're right. I think a lot of what we had a lot less of the doing because we were forced to be home. So all the doing had to stop for, or much of it. And so we could be. Yeah. And we were outside and coloring and doing puzzles and things just to keep us busy. And I will be the first to admit that it was the craziest time. I have small children, so that whole thing rocked my world. But now that we're kind of back, I look at some of those times very fondly. I'm like, man, I'd really love to have like a real conversation with my children and do puzzles together. Like, we are not doing that anymore because now we're running here and running there and running there. And what's the next thing we have to get to? All the doing.
Yeah.
So
you gave us our assignment, which is, so we did the field book for you, and you gave us an assignment, which is to facilitate some of those conversations.
Yeah,
yeah, absolutely.
Instead of saying, when are you going to be back in the office and when can I come and play in the classroom again? Say, how are you making this adjustment and how can I support you in that by facilitating conversations that are appreciative and have curiosity driven.
And you just slowed down and asked some beautiful generative questions, Tom. And it's curious, and that's what a question is. You're genuinely curious. You don't have the answer, and you're willing to sit there and lean in and listen.
And we need to keep practicing it. That's we're ending where we started, which is we recommend everybody get the book, everybody read the book, but then remember it's as good as your practice. Because when you read it, you go, oh yeah, we need to do more of this. But when I look at my life, sometimes not so much. And so we begin again. And I thank you for the second edition because that got me back into it more. I was always talking about it, but I don't know how consistently I was applying it. So I'm just grateful to both of you and your work.
Oh, thank you. So grateful for your invitation here.
Yep.
And I hope I get back to giving presentations because I still have 8 to 10 copies to give away. I was giving away at my talks and now nobody invites me except for and all I can do is recommend it. I guess I could stick it in the mail like you guys did. I got to be creative.
There you go.
There I'm assuming
find
I
a different way.
So there it is. Thank you for that. See, I almost said, I can't do it until they get
How could we do that differently?
Yeah. E-books, audiobooks.
Maybe
send a link.
We could facilitate conversations, Adrian, and we could give away a copy as a part of our conversation.
I love that.
There we go.
These things tie in. Your community and our community tie in so well, closely. Right? The common denominator is conversation.
Yes.
And we do intentionally call this not a blog or a podcast. It's a community of conversation. So we invite all the listeners to engage in us in conversation, and we can keep this appreciative inquiry going.
Conversations at the core of everything we do. It basically is all there is that creates this world.
Yeah.
So
thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you. This is such a wonderful conversation. We look forward to the next ones.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for listening to the Leadership Beyond podcast. We hope you benefited from this conversation as much as we have. We invite you to join our community of conversation. Subscribe to our podcast on iTunes, Spotify, or wherever you listen to podcasts. Don't forget to sign up at aleadershipbeyond.com for free materials and updates. That's aleadershipbeyond.com. Join us in 2 weeks for our next episode.